Ehrlich strongly advocated for the U.S. and other industrialized countries to cut food aid to poor countries that were deemed beyond help unless they adopted national population policies predicated on universal use of contraceptives. He also advocated population control in the U.S., quote, hopefully through changes in our value system, but by compulsion if voluntary methods fail, end quote. In addition to exhorting Americans to change their lifestyles and consumption practices to lessen their impact on world resources, using both an intellectual lens and emotional one, he appealed specifically to white middle class American audiences, stroking their fears of the growing global presence of dark skinned others. This emotional lens was refracted through his description of a family trip to India on a quote, stinking hot night in Delhi, end quote, which he famously described through his visceral reaction to the surroundings. Uh, as their ancient, quote, flea infested taxi clawed through the streets, the Ehrlichs entered a slum area where the streets were, quote, alive with people, people eating, people washing, people sleeping, people visiting, arguing, and screaming, people thrusting their hands through the taxi window, begging, people defecating and urinating, people clinging to buses, people hurting animals, people, end quote. The scene felt to him like hell. He and his family were frightened of the endless swell of bodies all around them. This was a sign of the hell that could inflict Americans if overpopulation were allowed to proceed unchecked. Unlike others before him, Ehrlich also argued that the U.S. and other overdeveloped countries were are also overpopulated because they cannot produce adequate resources to maintain their population's affluent lifestyles of resource consumption and technology use. All nations of the earth were overpopulated according to Ehrlich, and in need of population control. The kind of overpopulation was divided along the lines of resource shortage and population boom versus overconsumption of resources by small and affluent populations. Further, Ehrlich actually challenged the family planning solutions proposed by development actors and demographers, arguing that these approaches failed to fully resolve the environmental problems created by population growth. He broke with demographers over the issue of modernization and technology. Modernizers look for technological solutions to what they saw as cultural problems, whereas Ehrlich saw those problems as biological and thus amenable to technological changes. Ehrlich was a complicated figure, just as he emphasized the frightening growth of power, racialized populations overseas. He also turned the lens back on the white middle and upper classes in the U.S. As a strong antinatalist, he critiqued the reproductive and consumption practices of whites, as well as critiquing racial injustice and race-based justifications for population control in the U.S. Just 3 years after publishing The Population Bomb, Ehrlich and his co-author Richard Harriman wrote a book titled "How to Be a Survivor: A Plan to Save Spaceship Earth," in which they laid out their arguments in terms of race and civil rights. First and foremost, they proclaimed white middle class and wealthy Americans should be the primary targets of population control efforts, and the government should offer maximum incentives and minimal coercion unless the incentives proved unsuccessful, in which case more coercive measures should be undertaken. More to the point, these interventions were not meant to target marginalized communities. Quote, above all, no effort should be made to single out the poor, people on welfare, or non-whites as special targets for population control. It is among the middle class and wealthy populations that population control presents the most serious problems, end quote. Why did Ehrlich and Harriman take this stance? For them, despite the fact that population growth rates were higher among non-whites and the poor, It was affluence-based resource consumption in the U.S. that was destroying the environment. Further, they argued that affluence-based consumption is directly connected to environmental burdens of the poor, higher body burdens of the DDT and other pesticides attributable to overuse and misuse. Hold on. Okay. Overuse and misuse of these chemicals by commercial, agricultural, and other industries, as well as the lower quality, nutrient deficient foods available in low income communities. Ehrlich and Harriman also thought of focusing on middle and upper class whites as a strategic way of minimizing racial tensions and controlling controversies, arguing that, quote, the best way to avoid the hint of genocide is to control the population of the dominant group, end quote. They were concerned about black communities' anxieties about coercion in contraceptive and abortion clinics in ghettos. Thus, they proposed that reproductive health services be administered locally and voluntarily by community members. Quote, black women in a ghetto should have access to contraception and safe abortion if they want it, but they should not have to seek such services from white men or women. Let black women run the clinics, end quote. Further, this is actually something Margaret Sanger thought of too. I imagine the author will get to that point, actually. Alright. Further, their proposition on race included increasing living standards for the poor as a way of addressing white racism. For example, they argued that contraceptives and abortion should be made freely available to all American women, and that those whites who were uncomfortable with the thought of raising a black population should do their best to support increasing affluence among blacks, since affluent blacks tend to have fewer children than affluent whites. Of course, Ehrlich's positions on population policy were complex and contradictory. He advocated coercive state-based proposals, taxes on child-related necessities, sterilization of males with 3 children or more in high-growth nations, adding sterilization chemicals to the U.S. public water supply that would have disproportionately impacted people of color and the poor. I mean, there's already people trying to say stuff like this now, so that's pretty weird. While producing their social agenda on population, Ehrlich and his contemporaries were also steeped in the production of scientific models and mathematical equations. Okay, so obviously when people talk about like putting chemicals in the water, it's just like conspiracies about feminization and such like that. So it seems like a different topic. Oh, okay. Anyways, mathematical equations attempting to ground their dire environmental predictions and social political advocacy into cold hard facts. In 1971, Ehrlich and John Holdren developed an equation, I equals Pat, which they claimed demonstrated the ways population interacts with affluence or resource consumption and technology used to produce a range of negative environmental impacts. In this equation, one impacts are that could mean a Roman numeral 1, okay. I, for impact, are the direct result of the product of P, population, A, affluence, and T, technology. A model that reduces a host of uneven and complex social, political, and economic factors determining population trends and resource use into a rather extreme level of simplicity. These elements did not represent equal relationships to environmental impacts. Rather, the authors argued that population growth, quote, causes a disproportionate negative impact on the environment, a factor that they promoted as a clear scientific basis for advocating population control. Moreover, the IPAT model was intended to represent a universal set of relationships, with a one-size-fits-all approach focusing on population control, changing systems of technology, contribution, restricted resource use, and poverty alleviation at a global level. The 20th century proliferation of carrying capacity and planetary limits discourses, as well as quantification of political arguments about population growth, culminated in the Club of Rome Commission project, The Limits to Growth. This book drew on system dynamics theory to produce a series of computer-generated models projecting how the exponential growth of population, food production, and consumption patterns would interact with resources such as petroleum, gold, iron, and chromium over a period of 200 years. The computer models rather predictably indicated that eventually population growth would overshoot available resources and a collapse in food production would occur, leading to the club's conclusion that human population growth and resource use far exceed the carrying capacity of the Earth's finite resources. The book's arguments were focused on resource shortages and scarcity. Their conclusions were that governments would divert resources to managing scarcity, such that overall quality of life for many people would decline in the 21st century. It declines through the hoarding of the allocation by throwing away plates of food. It's actually that simple. Like, that literal plate of food, in like the most simple way of saying this, could literally go to someone else. I've seen plates of food while I'm doing dishes at a restaurant literally be poured into the trash. So you would already think this was like happening now if people are doing that, but that's like kind of contradictory. If like there's food being thrown away, like there's no one eating that, overpopulation would suggest there's no food on that plate at all, but there's a plate of food being thrown away as there's 8 billion people. So honestly, it's just insane, this conspiracy of overpopulation. Okay, theirs was a clear carrying capacity argument. However, it was buttressed by the technologically advanced strategy of extending predictions into the near and distant future through scenario modeling. See Chapter 3. In an updated version published 30 years later, the authors repeated their dire predictions. Quote, "Sadly, we believe the world will experience overshoot and collapse in global resource use and emissions, much the same as dot-com bubble, though on a much longer time scale." End quote. Their proposed solution to overshoot and collapse was sustainability, defined as the conditions that allow societies to persist over generations. Unlike neo-Malthusians before them, they argued for a modicum of social equality. Their notion of sustainability required keeping exponential growth in check through providing universal adequate standards of living and fair distribution of resources. They advocated limited growth focused on supporting important social goals and enhancing sustainability, and exhorted societies to eventually stop pursuing this growth once their specific goals were met. This was not necessarily zero growth, but rather a strategy based on qualitative assessments of who and what development is for, and who would benefit, what costs would be and how long it would be, and whether the Earth could accommodate it. In this model, sustainable societies are also societies that address and overcome poverty, unemployment, and unmet non-material needs. But we have Secretary of Treasury, an economist, literally saying we need more unemployment for the economy to be fixed. So there's just psychopaths running this ship already. It has nothing to do with the poor. Alright. Conclusion. As this chapter has demonstrated, population has been constructed over time as a scientific, social, political, and economic problem. Throughout the 20th century, ideas of national identity, geopolitical stability, natural resource security, and living with limits have preoccupied various scientists and policymakers. directly influencing their ideas about how their scientific ideas should be applied. The next chapter turns to these questions in more depth. It explores the close linkage of science and politics and knowledge production on population growth and climate change, and demonstrates how this relationship entangles and embeds the questions of power and privilege operating from behind the scenes. Moreover, it explores and raises questions about the role of policy concerns in scientific research, and not only projects, but produces the future. Alright guys, I will see you in the next one.